Hi, today, or for this lesson, I'd like to switch to chapter 14 on language and communication. So, this is an interesting subject, and in fact, it requires more than just a chapter. As we've already established, in North America, the four-field approach to anthropology actually lists linguistic anthropology as an entire subdiscipline. We've covered a fair bit of archaeology, physical anthropology. We spent the whole first part of this course on some of those subjects, and unfortunately for the linguistic anthropologists, they get a little bit of short shrift here, with only a chapter devoted to the linguistic anthropology as a separate subject. But it's important to at least address what linguistic anthropology is, because it actually works into some of these other cultural anthropological matters that we'll be coming to in the subsequent chapters. One of the reasons why, as we saw in the last chapters, is that culture doesn't just exist as a fixed, static object that you can pick up and examine as a specimen. It's a living thing. It's a process. It's an interaction between structure and agency. And how does this interaction take place? Well, through communication. So understanding linguistic anthropology is really understanding the processes by which we communicate culture to one another and how we understand it ourselves. So how does linguistic anthropology separate itself from, let's say, an English teacher would deal with language or that sort of a thing? Well, anthropologists and linguistic anthropologists, linguists, unlike people that are dealing with English language or Spanish language or some formalistic structure, although that's interesting to anthropologists, the formalized structure of a language, that's less interesting on its surface to an anthropologist than in other words, how someone is supposed to talk or how someone is supposed to write as to how people actually communicate. We're interested in the use of language as a communication device in its actual emic form. How is it used? So, for instance, we all know that soft drink or Coke or soda or pop, all of those mean the same thing, right? But what do you use in your language? And in fact, it tells you something about yourself, what your identity and your inclusion in a particular culture. You can differentiate yourself or include yourself in a community by the types of words that you use and the manner in which you use them. So, first of all, what we need to understand is what language is. Well, language can be spoken or written, and it can even be nonverbal. But it's a means of communication, and it's extremely important to humans for transmitting and dealing with culture. And in fact, you have to understand it as part of that culture to be able to use it. So it's very easy to learn the words of a language but not actually understand how that's used culturally. To give you an example, I had a friend who was he was Finnish, and he learned Japanese. He learned all the words, and he even communicated with Japanese people and learned to speak the language, and he was fluent in Japanese. But when I spoke to a Japanese person who had been speaking to him, they found it a little bit strange, because clearly when he was learning it from a woman, and in Japanese language you speak very differently if you're a female or if you're a male, and he was a male and he had learned from a female, and this was a very unusual thing. So learning the words is not just enough. It's not just a rattling off vocabulary. You become enculturated into the language and using a language just as you do every other form of culture that you learn when you're growing up. Language is arbitrary. It's based on arbitrary associations between sounds and some other meaning. And in fact, the arbitrariness of it is what makes it useful. that it's not just pointing at something and saying ugh, ugh, and equating these things. You can actually say more broad things than just one-to-one correlations between things that exist in the world and other things that exist in the world. You can talk about concepts. You can talk about more abstract things than just physical things that exist in the world. Other animals have the ability to just point at things or have associations between call signs, for instance, and in fact even can discuss things like past and future events. We saw this in an earlier chapter where there are certain types of monkeys that will add something to their words that they, or the sounds that they make, which indicate that the threat is not present, but it was there before. So crack means a leopard. It's a leopard alarm. And crackoo of the colobus monkey means there was a leopard there. And so that's a sort of sophisticated identification of things that are in the world, but we can do more than that as humans. We have a much more sophisticated communication system. And that communication system exists within a culture. So it can't really be extracted from the culture without losing some of that meaning. So in terms of just simple language ability amongst other animals, we have a greater capacity, but we should put ourselves onto a continuum as well. And we've seen this, that other animals have the ability to communicate. Even ants can communicate with one another, but it's not really abstract. It's not doesn't involve the sort of forethought and imagination that humans can have, which, as we've seen in our chapters on human evolution, this has become extremely important to our survival, is our ability to imagine a world and then make it so. Other animals don't rely on that sort of cognitive ability that we do, so we have to have an equally sophisticated communication system to express a more sophisticated cognition that we have. So, as part of our evolution, part of it is just our brains are bigger, and we saw that. Gorillas and chimpanzees can actually use sign language. American Sign Language has been taught to gorillas and chimpanzees, that they have 400 or 500 words, up to 700 or 800 in fact, with gorillas, Coco in particular, and actually use these words that they can actually combine into things that don't exist. It's not just pointing and saying one to one, this is that, I want this food. It's actually combining different concepts that can come together into some imagined phrasing. So that's about the limit of what a gorilla or a chimpanzee can do, and that's where we can imagine our ancestors, before we developed our big brains, would have been able to do. But as our brains started to develop, we needed some new language capabilities, and one of those is actually a gene, a mutated form of a gene called the pt1 gene. Is something that we have. Actually, Neanderthals have been shown now to have had the pt1 gene as well. And this has been shown that there's a genetic element to being able to create and understand language in humans. So Neanderthals also would have been able to speak just like us. They also had a certain type of hyoid bone, which has been found, and it's similar to the ones that we have, maybe a little bit formed differently. So they might have sounded a little different than us, but they could have made the range of sounds that we had to make language that would have been comprehensible. Also, we have a hemispherical brain, so it's even our brain architecture is related to the ability to create and interpret language. Also, as you're becoming enculturated, as you're growing and learning language, obviously infants don't necessarily recognize or understand words, but you learn to get these. But some of the earliest things that you start to learn as an infant, as you're becoming enculturated as a human, is nonverbal communication. You learn to appreciate actions which accompany your words, and those can be interpreted almost as reliably as the words themselves in many cases. But once again, they are culturally determined, so you can't really extract them from their cultural background. So, for instance, in Greece, if I were to take off my glasses and say, raise my eyebrows or tilt my head up, and I were to say oki, that means, paradoxically, means no. All of those clues, the eyebrows being raised, the head tilt, and the word oki literally means no. All of those things mean no. And ne, if I say ne, that means, to our ears, that sounds like no, but it actually means yes in Greece. And also, shaking the head means I don't understand. It doesn't mean no. So these are where nonverbal communication also it enhances and supports, or can be forms of communication independent of language, but they also have cultural context to them. We would understand those nonverbal clues differently. Things like personal space are culturally conditioned as well. It's been shown that people in Eastern Europe, for instance, stand much closer to one another when they're speaking. And Western European people and Americans put a little more distance between each other. These days, I guess we need to put 6 feet between us. But a particular study put people at a cocktail party together, drinking glasses of wine, and had Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans all in the same room, having conversations with one another, and very slowly, very subtly, the Eastern Europeans would be invading the space of the Western Europeans. The Western European would take a step back, very subtly, very almost imperceptibly shift their weight to their back foot, and then the Eastern European would close in because they were reducing the space between them. And slowly but surely you had this dance around the room with these two partners all having, in time-lapse photography, showing them circling the room with the Eastern Europeans moving forward and the Western Europeans moving backwards. And so this is where even how close you stand can be a form of nonverbal communication that is enculturated into that particular group. So moving on to language itself and speech, this is something that can be done scientifically. I mean, words are physical traces in the world. It may not sound, may not feel like that, but I am making vibrations in the real world that go through the airwaves and into the microphone here and onto this recording. So in this case, this is recorded. But if I was out in the middle of nowhere and I said something, that would be a very fleeting physical object in the world. It would be gone as soon as I said it. But it is a real object, and that can be studied as any other material can. So the scientific study of spoken language involves a few different aspects, including phonology, morphology, lexicon, and syntax. And together these make up a language. So a phonology is the study of the actual sounds that are present and significant in a particular language. And so that's the range of sounds that you make. And phonologists actually study these sounds. So you can study the wavelengths, you can study the timbre, you can study some of the inflection. All of these things are the range of vocalizations and sounds that humans make. Just a few years ago, there was a new sound that was discovered about 20 years ago. I say discovered, it was used and it was identified as something that had never really been isolated as a different phoneme, as it's called, a sound. A phoneme is a sound. And It's the smallest sound that can be made as a distinct unit. This sound was or. And some of you might know that, might be familiar with this, but it's actually a Long Island sound. That this was something that only this community seems to make this sound, and it had never been identified as an isolated phoneme, a sound that this is peculiar and unlike any other sound made. So Long Island. And so that's a phoneme. Wa. Morphology is the way that you combine these phonemes together, these sounds, to create a morpheme, which is a word, or meaningful parts of a word. And so you take the sounds and you either one on its own, so is the article a, right? So a word, or a word. Is the sound, that is the morpheme. Is also, as a single morpheme, also constitutes, as a phoneme, constitutes a morpheme, which is the article, the indefinite article for word. So a word. But also morphology can be many sounds put together. Triskaidekaphobia, fear of the number 13, is many different morphemes put together into triskaidekaphobia. And that's a multi-syllable word which has many different phonemes that are combined to make a single morpheme, which is a word. And together, all of these morphemes that are combined create a lexicon, which is essentially a dictionary. So the list of the entirety of the morphemes that a language uses at any given moment in time is its lexicon or dictionary. And this changes too, because language changes, because language is intrinsically linked to culture. And so as culture changes, we use different words. And so every year the dictionaries update with new words. Some words that we use may be so specific to your group of friends that you just have some made-up word that you use. Is that going to be added to the dictionary? No, but it's part of your lexicon. It's part of an understood set of words that is used in your very tiny culture. And so dictionaries tend to be written for larger groups because they've got to sell those books. And so the English language has a dictionary, but does that include every word that's used in a language? Not necessarily. And then syntax is the relationship between these words in the lexicon. That is to say, how they are put together to form ideas, not just words having meaning, but sentences. So as you listen to me speak, you're understanding some larger meaning than just a list of words. I am putting those together in a particular format that creates additional meaning because of their relationship. So that syntax is things like grammar, sentence structure, phrasing, and that sort of thing. Now, language relates to culture, but it also relates to thought. So, and in fact, some people like Ludwig Wittgenstein would consider that you can't have thought without language. It's an infant, a newborn. How much are they thinking about things? Probably not very much, because they haven't actually formed the ability to combine words and concepts together to have some kind of an imaginative process, to consider what the world is like, reflect upon it, and make some judgments about it. So an infant isn't even really thinking because they don't have language. They are just receiving information and trying to process that and build that into their brain structure. Noam Chomsky, very famous linguistic anthropologist, has argued that the brain actually has a limited set of rules for grammatical structure, organizing language, and that sort of a thing. And so all languages have a common structural basis. and he sees this as a sort of a universal grammar. That doesn't mean that the individual grammars of each language follow the same essential rules, but that humans think the same. And so there is, in the sense that time moves forward and we perceive it that way, and we have cause and effect. All of these things have to be organized in our languages in the same way that we organize them in our brains. So I hit this with a hammer, it's hard, it smashes something, right? That's a cause, it's effect, and I can describe it. All languages have some ability to deal with the real world around us, and so there is a common structural basis to all languages. Does that mean that they're all put together the same way? No. So for instance, in the English language, we have a predicate, we have a subject, and then we have what it's describing. So we have we have a subject, we have an activity, and we have the object of that activity. So I hit this object with a hammer, right? I hit this object with a hammer. I is the subject, hit is the verb, the activity, and the object with the hammer is describing the activity that's being taken a place upon. But in something like the German language, you put all of your actors first. So you put I with the hammer, object, hit. And that's a difference. So the verb comes at the end in the German language. So everything is, all of the actors, all of your participants in this activity are clustered up at the beginning of the sentence, and then you have to be patient and wait for the activity until the very end. And this is what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, in the sense that the structure of your language actually affects or is affected by the way you think. And so language and your language structure isn't just a consequence of you thinking things and expressing them, but it actually affects the way that you think about them. So to Germans, it's you have to be patient and wait for that verb. The verb comes at the end. All of the actors in the world are sort of clustered in one end of your description. Whereas for English, in English language, we separate them into parts. And so we've got a very wide gap between the actor and the acted upon. That is something that actually affects the way we view the world. So that's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Also,